released this study that you all probably saw, which basically highlighted to the public and to the activist community and everyone else that we have a problem with PFAS in our food packaging material. And the results are shown here. So you can go look at their study and see all the details, but the fundamental take-home message is, whoa. I mean, look at the dessert and bread wrappers, for example, and then the sandwich wrappers. And then, of course, interestingly, none were found in the paper cups. Now, this was using a fluorine. The bulk of the work was just basically saying, is there fluorine in the products? And Kelvin and other people will be talking about that later. And by the way, I'm not going to talk about why PFAS is a big bad thing. Other people are talking about that. I didn't want to duplicate their talks. So thus, as a zero waste organization, and because we are wanting to get people to do more composting, and if you have that inedible food, getting it into your organics collection, this was a big, big concern. And came to learn that there really wasn't very much assessment of the compost in this story. What there was some work being done by Linda Lee and her team, and this is her principal was the primary author on this study. So this is one study from 2014 looking at only PFOA and PFAS, the long chains, in compost that was primarily biosolids based. And here are the locations. You can see that Tagro from Tacoma was included in the assessments that they did there. So basically, I nosed around and figured out that Linda Lee was the person I wanted to talk to. And so I approached her and I said, hey, if we get some compost samples, would you do the analysis of it? And of course, we have no money to offer you. And she said, well, I have a new grad student who needs a project. Let me see. And so basically with her own funding and her own technical work, and they were developing the techniques also to analyze, because this was so new at that point, although, by the way, perfluorinated chemicals have been around for decades, so honestly, it shouldn't have been so new, but anyway, they were. And so she agreed that if we were to collect compost samples, send them to her, she would do their lab, and they would do an analysis of that. So that was totally wonderful of her to say yes. And she has turned out to be, as you all probably know, a leader in the country on this issue. So what we did is we collected very quietly 10 samples of, by the way, I'm just trying to give you a fun story to start off your day, really. We collected 10 samples from Washington, Oregon, California, Massachusetts, and North Carolina. And we got the compost that was at the point of sale. In other words, not the material. This is what the consumer or the landscaper would get. And we were looking for, we knew the sources of them, but in any case, we were not going to the composters themselves. And Susan can attest to that, because we basically said, we want to keep you all out of this. We want to give you plausible deniability about this. Here's what the samples looked like. I collected them and mailed them to them, and then they did their processing. So this is what the 10 samples look like after they did some of their processing. And here is, so this was all in service of the idea of doing a policy bill in Washington State. Toxic Free Future is the lead on this. And then we testified, and some of the people who are on the call today on the Zoom also testified. So this was the fact sheet that we did. And actually the fact sheet is super easy to read. And this was done for the legislators. This was actually done in February of 2018. It says March because we did have an update in March, but this was done in February. And what you can see here are, in order of chains, chain length, you can see 10 samples. The samples 1 through 7 are the samples that are compost made with where they're accepting food service products in their stream. And in the top 3, number 8, 9, and 10, these were ones where food service products were not being incorporated, although interestingly, so number 8 and 10 were where they were compost made with leaf and yard waste only, and commercial. And then the backyard waste one, which is number 9, they actually had coffee filters that they're using there. So it could have been just the food that they had from their home, but we're not sure why it had slightly higher levels than the 2 commercial ones that were just yard waste, mainly leaves. Okay, so this was part of the work that helped get this bill passed. of course, the issue stands on its own without even having the compost impact. And so Rep. Joan McBride led this, and now you'll hear more about the AA, the Alternative Assessments process that Ecology is doing to identify safer alternatives. But the idea is that there are going to be products banned in Washington State on January 1, 2022. We wish there were more, but Ecology is busy working on doing the assessments right now, so you'll hear more about that in a moment. So then, as you know, things churn in the academic world. It wasn't until May 29th of 2019, so a whole year later, that the actual publication came out. So this is the publication that was in a scientific, peer-reviewed journal. And I love the little drawing that they did, because obviously they don't normally deal with yard waste or compostables. They made this wonderful graphic. That's the fun thing about this. And here is a figure, the same information, but by the time it got published, there was more analysis with regard to the sampling technique, et cetera, et cetera. So you get the same figure basically in a more fancy way here. And then there was a ton of media that came out of that. So there were lots and lots of articles that came out right at that, and a little slug of interest. Now, I'm going to finish up here by talking about bioplastics in general, because this came up the other day. So there's a new report that came out, a study that came out in Europe on September 2020. And because in general, the perfluorinated chemicals have been found in the molded fiber products, not necessarily in plastic products that are food to go where, although we are finding PFAS is associated with some plastic things, like, for example, the turf grass, because it's used as a mold ejector chemical to get the molded plastics out. But anyway, I just want to highlight this particular study for you, because the concern here is that the PLA and other bio-based food serviceware is showing that it has toxic chemicals in it. So it's not like we have a panacea here. And then to finish up, so the goal that we are working on for next session is an organics waste management bill, a big one. And we invite any of you who are interested in participating in stakeholder process this summer to get in contact with me afterwards. And we also just released last Friday our new report, and many of you were interviewed for this, looking at policy options for organic management, material management. And it was not meant to be controversial. We're basically trying to pull together all the experts in the state, of which we have many. Here are the 37 actual policy recommendations. I'm not going to go into them in detail here, but these are in the report done by category. And of course, part of that is the food service products is in there in different ways. So I will stop there.
Great, thank you, Heather. Thank you for sharing all that information with us. I'll just give about 30 seconds for anyone to put in some final clarifying questions before we move on to the next speaker.
It was clear as mud. All good.
And I forgot to mention, oh, I'm sorry. You go first.
Could I ask one question? This is Stephanie Schweiger from the city of Seattle. I was just wondering, did that look at paper? Does the legislation, or did the sampling include like paper bags? And I'm wondering if that type of material falls under the compostable packaging legislation.
Okay, good question. No, so we were only looking at the compost itself. So we don't know specifically what products were going in. This is real life. This is real compost. It was not lab scale where you could actually compose your own compost. This was actual compost that we acquired or purchased. So we don't know if there were bags in it or not, probably some. And in terms of the ordinance is about food service products, and I don't believe bags are included, because at that same time, we were, by the way, working on getting ready to do bag bills. But I don't think, and Shirley, not Shirley, Holly might be able to answer that, but I'm pretty sure bags are not included in the paper bag. The carry home bags are not, but I'm not sure about produce bags, but I'm pretty sure they're not included.
Okay. just interested because I know that, I mean, like, you know, the craft paper bags, you could put in your recycling or in your compost in a lot of places. Okay, thank you.
Kelvin, did you have a comment that you wanted to make?
I have a question actually for Heather, if you don't mind. Question is there legislation also take into account paper-based agricultural film, which has a lot of PFAS in it too, typically? And that is
No,
often composted too.
Not only does it not include film, so this was food service products, the legislation that passed in 2018. But we do have another bill we worked on in 2019 with many people on this call as well on compostable products, and ag film got exempted. It's a very strong lobby here in the state.
Yeah, because the paper product has a lot of PFAS in it too for that.
Morning, everyone. Go ahead and get this out. All right. So morning, everyone. As Rory said, oh, sorry, I'm actually gonna stop sharing my video. I apologize. I'm also competing a little bit for bandwidth this morning and would like you all to be able to hear me clearly, hopefully. So yeah, morning, everyone. My name is Rae Eaton. I am a chemist with the Department of Ecology. I'm joined today by Holly Davies from the Department of Health, and we are here to talk very briefly about the work that we've been doing looking for alternatives to PFAS in paper-based food packaging through an alternatives assessment process. So Heather already mentioned this, but just a little bit of quick background. So this work was started after a bill passed the state legislature in 2018 that prohibits the sale or distribution of paper-based food packaging that has intentionally added PFAS in any amount in the state of Washington. This bill included a requirement that before any ban could take effect, that the Department of Ecology must first identify that there are safer alternatives that are available to replace PFAS, and to identify those safer alternatives through an alternatives assessment process. I'll also add here that we are also directed that the ban would only take effect for specific types of food packaging, or as they refer to it, specific food packaging applications. And so we weren't just looking for one alternative that could blanket replace PFAS, but instead looking for alternatives to PFAS in specific types of food packaging. So just a little bit of context about what I mean when I say food packaging. So the food packaging that we are focusing on is specifically packaging that is paper-based, makes direct contact with food, and what we've been focusing on is packaging that's used to hold freshly prepared food when it's being delivered someplace, or when it's being used like when someone's consuming the food. In these types of food packaging, PFAS are typically added to provide oil, grease, and water resistance to that food packaging. And once it's in the food packaging, it can then migrate from the packaging into the food, and then people will ingest the PFAS when they consume it. As Heather mentioned, studies have found that PFAS have been used in all sorts of paper-based food packaging, but I will add that we have observed that they are especially common in molded fiber products. So for an example, the molded fiber clamshell that I'm showing in this picture here. So generally, I have found that people aren't as familiar with the alternatives assessment process. So I did want to take a moment to actually step through what it means to do an alternatives assessment, and how that actually, like what information we collected and how we used it. So generally, an alternatives assessment process is comprised of 3 stages. The first stage is sort of understanding the work that you want to look at. The second stage is collecting information on the chemical you're looking to replace, and then also the potential replacements for that chemical, and looking at it through multiple different lenses. So for example, most commonly you'll look at comparing the chemical hazards associated with the chemical you're trying to replace and the alternatives, relative performance between the two, differences in the cost and availability, and then also potentially differences in whether or not people will be exposed to that chemical or the alternative. The idea with an alternatives assessment is really to prioritize not only a movement towards safer chemicals, so reducing the hazards associated with chemicals and therefore reducing the risk, but also making sure that the alternatives that are identified are also technically feasible and available within the market. Because you can imagine we can identify a perfect alternative that is much safer than PFAS, but if it's not offered for sale by anyone and it doesn't perform as well, no one will adopt it. With the alternatives assessment process, once you collect all that information, you then in our case, we're comparing the alternatives to PFAS, and we're looking to see, have we identified any alternatives that do as well or better than PFAS across all of those considerations. So the hazard, the performance, and the cost and availability. If we've identified alternatives that do as well as PFAS in all of those criteria, then we have identified what the law considers a safer alternative to PFAS in that type of food packaging. If it doesn't perform as well in one or more categories, so you could think, the performance isn't good of that alternative, then it doesn't meet all of our criteria, and so it doesn't meet our requirements for a safer alternative. I'll also add, I'm not really going into this today, but also these alternatives assessments do take a lot of information in order to fully assess alternatives against a chemical of concern. And so it's also very likely that we will find that we just don't have enough information about an alternative to reach a conclusion about whether or not it meets our definition for a safer alternative to PFAS. So I don't want to spend too long on the alternatives assessment. It's quite a long document, and I'm happy if folks are interested, we can either talk more in the breakout sessions about the specifics later, or I'm happy to always set up a meeting with people separately to go into more detail. But I did want to review some of the really general broad findings from our alternatives assessment. So the first one is what we identified in terms of, are there less hazardous alternatives to PFAS available within the market? And here we're really looking to evaluate the hazards associated with chemicals using either the EPA's Safer Chemicals Ingredients List, which is a list of chemicals that have been generated via the Environmental Protection Agency's Safer Choice Master Criteria. So this is a process for basically identifying the best in class chemicals and encouraging companies to adopt those chemicals and use them in their products. And then there also is a few other types of hazard assessment methods that we can use to evaluate the hazards associated with a chemical. Once we did that, we compared our alternatives to PFAS, and we found that the following 5 alternatives were less hazardous than PFAS. So this can be things like using uncoated paper instead of PFAS, so just getting rid of the chemical treatment entirely. Clay-based treatments, wax coating treatments, and then 2 types of a polymer-based treatment. One was polyvinyl alcohol, and the other one is polylactic acid, which is also often referred to as PLA. We also, as I mentioned, are concerned with identifying that the alternatives are technically feasible alternatives and are also available within the market, so they're actually being used in food packaging products. In terms of the performance, we generally identified that the alternative products that we found are more or less functionally equivalent to those that contain PFAS. There are a few exceptions to this. For example, there were some PFAS-free molded fiber products, so where they've replaced PFAS with some other treatment to provide oil and grease resistance, that don't work as well if they're trying to hold an extremely oily food, so they're not quite up to par there. And then, of course, we also identified alternative products that are made entirely out of PLA plastic, and those don't work very well if they're holding extremely hot foods. In terms of cost and availability, we did find that all of the products that we were looking at are offered for sale in the US, so it is possible for anyone to go out and buy them. But when we specifically considered particularly whether or not these products were cost comparable with similar products that contain PFAS, we did find that not all of the products that we were looking at were cost comparable. So that really narrowed down ultimately the alternatives where we were able to identify, the types of food packaging where we were able to identify alternatives that met all of our criteria. With that in mind, as I mentioned earlier, there are some limitations with this assessment. In general, alternatives assessments take a lot of information in order to conduct them. And so in particular, because we are a state agency, we can't force people to give us private information. We did run into some issues where we just weren't able to gather enough information to complete the alternatives assessment for every alternative we wanted to look at. This was particularly true in the following 3 instances. The first one was when we were trying to establish whether the alternatives were less hazardous than PFAS. That list I showed you did not show all of the alternatives we looked at, and that's not because we found a bunch of alternatives that were definitely as hazardous as PFAS. We actually found a number of alternatives where we just couldn't get enough information to fully assess their hazards. Additionally, when we were actually looking at performance, cost, and availability, we ran into the issue that a lot of companies don't like to publicize what they're using in place of PFAS. So they might advertise something as PFAS free, but they won't actually specify what they're using instead. Relatedly, companies often don't like to publicize how much their products cost. And in particular, different purchasers are going to pay different prices for products based on the volume that they buy and their relationship with the company. So it can be very difficult to actually get enough information to really determine whether or not those alternatives are of comparable cost with products that use PFAS. So just to conclude really quickly, we did put all of the information together and did identify that there are alternatives that meet all of our criteria and are safer alternatives to PFAS in 4 types of food packaging. Those were wraps and liners, plates, food boats, and pizza boxes. That alternatives assessment was included in a report that we submitted to the legislature in February of 2021. And so beginning in February 2023, all intentionally added PFAS is going to be banned in those types of food packaging. So what the overall impact of this is going to be is, as I said, intentionally added PFAS is going to be prohibited in wraps and liners, plates, food boats, and pizza boxes beginning in February of 2023. If a type of food packaging does not meet the definitions that we laid out for those 4 types of food packaging, so for example, bowls, PFAS will still be permitted in that food packaging. However, we are actively working right now on a new alternatives assessment that is working to identify safer alternatives for the types of food packaging where we weren't able to identify safer alternatives in our first assessment. So I did want to say that if folks are interested in getting involved, we're trying to get the word out, first of all, about the ban beginning in February of 2023. And so, you know, to the extent that you're able to pass along information about that, we really want to encourage people to start thinking now, if they need to, about how to transition away from food packaging that will be subsequently banned. Also, as I said, we're working on our second alternatives assessment. So in particular, if you work with stakeholders who might be affected or interested in our work, like food packaging manufacturers, grocery stores, other food retailers such as restaurants, we encourage you to get in touch with us. And in particular, if you have groups that are interested in getting more involved with our process, please do let us know. And if there's time, I'm happy to take a question or two now, Rory. Otherwise, we can just hopefully talk to folks in the breakout rooms.
Yeah, thanks, Rae. Yeah, I think in order to there seems like there's a question in the chat, and maybe we could save that for when we do the breakout rooms. But just in order to make sure we have enough time for all of our speakers, I think we'll proceed to the next speaker that we have on the docket. Thank you, Rae. Next, we'll be moving to Susan Thoman from the Compost Manufacturing Alliance. Susan, you have the floor.
Okay, and can you see my screen? Can you see my screen?
Yes, we can, Susan.
Good, okay. Yeah, so thank you for having CMA here today. I know many of you on here. It's good to see some familiar names. And the Compost Manufacturing Alliance has evolved quite a bit since it started in 2017. What we are here to talk about today, though, is that
CMA matches recognized lab standards with field standards to create important certification.
I think this is a pre-recorded one or something. I'm sorry. I don't know where that voice came from.
I ask myself that same question sometimes. Okay.
Okay, let's see if I can do this now. Okay, we're a third-party certifier of compostables, one of 2 in the country, so we've grown into that role. And really what we do is take ASTM standards in the lab that give us that assurance that it meets all the standards for toxicity, biodegradation, disintegration, various things that Kelvin's an expert on. And we add a field disintegration test as part of our certification. We also have a total fluorine standard of less than 100 total, 100 parts per million total fluorine, and a method, a recommended method for testing that we were advised by Dr. Okamoto on. So our certification program contains these elements. We have a federally registered certification mark in both the US and one pending in Canada. I mentioned that we accept the ASTM standards as a precursor to our certification, along with having ISO 17025 approved lab lists, a fluorine testing protocol, again, a field disintegration test. And we also connected to a network nationwide of composters that have all agreed to use the same standards so we can advance our knowledge of compostables together as an industry. We're very, very fortunate that we've attracted some exceptional talent to CMA on the technical side. Janet Thoman is on this call. She's our compliance director, my sister as well, and my business partner. Kelvin Okamoto's here. You've met him. Carrie Rolnick is a chemist and health physicist. I'm over here on the peninsula, who worked at the Puget Sound Naval Shipyard for years and also at an Ecology lab for a number of years. And Alex Thomas is a fellow at the University of Wisconsin, currently studying antibiotics and mortalities composting. So we have that rich experience to draw from. And we're also composter owned and operated. I won't go through all the partners, but we are composter owned and operated and a national certification. So we test in 3 processes. We test our field disintegration in windrow, covered in vessel, and ASP. And then we literally put products in bags, put them all the way through the processes and facilities across the country, pull those bags out, give a before and after photo. And if you meet the disintegration requirement, you get your CMA certification. Our network of the facilities are across the US, you can see, and we are now in other areas of the country. So on the PFAS issue, we were invited to the Green Policy Institute in Berkeley. I think, Heather, you were there in 2016. Started working on our policy development with the Center for Environmental Health out of San Francisco, and also Jen Jackson, who'd done a lot of work on their legislation in the city of San Francisco. So they helped us put together, and Heather, you did as well, a policy that we could follow. And we also had to deal with our resources limited. So it took us a little longer than BPI to get our policy set up, because we literally had to go through every item and get all the documentation we needed to set our policy. We already talked about the product categories that contain PFAS historically. Those are fiber-based products and paper items that hold greasy materials like cookie bags and French fry bags. And our policy started and was developed so that effective January 1st, we took no new items that contain greater than 100 parts per million fluorine into our system for field testing. And then it took us a year to remove all the items, get all the documentation for all the items that did contain PFAS. So anything on our approved list for any of the cities we work for is does not have PFAS. So both BPI and CMA are following the same program. We have a total fluorine laboratory testing method requirement. And again, we were advised by Dr. Okamoto on this, but he'll talk a little bit more about this, but it's really important that we have a standard that everyone follows. So if you get a 500 parts per million from this lab, total fluorine, and this lab says you have 50 parts per million, that's an issue, because how do you enforce that? So we're really looking forward to those standards being an ASTM standard, as I understand it, so that everyone's using the same standard and the results aren't wildly different. Ways to support us in this process, and I'll speak for the compost industry. We all know the environmental benefits of compost, and I think the science is still developing. So when you look at climate change mitigating strategies, carbon sequestration, the way it can filter out impurities in the environment. We want to, make sure we're putting it in the context of the positive environmental benefits while we're working on getting this issue addressed, so it's not a problem down the road. And it's important to ask, folks, schools, procurement groups, are your products certified? Because both CMA and BPI require, they have a PFAS limit or a total fluorine limit. The industry itself has had some experience with these types of things. Many of you have been involved. Persistent herbicides have always been an issue that U.S. Composting Council's worked on. And there's other resources that I have a resource list at the end of my presentation on, how to buy the right products that aren't in the PFAS category, put out that by the Responsible Purchasing Network. And again, I'll give a shout out to the Center for Environmental Health in San Francisco, who's developed quite a good educational section of their website. Finally, the current challenges and opportunities in this is the replacement product development. Rae talked about it, is slow. So we have food collection programs in some cities we work with across the US where the school programs can't start because they really don't have a food tray, a rigid tray to use. So there are some gaps in the program for starting programs. It's more about starting programs of programs that exist. And with COVID, everything packaging, like whatever package you could get, because takeout became our lifestyle in many situations, they just, whatever was on the shelf got sold. So we kind of regressed back to seeing a lot of foam and other things out there in the market that were cheap and available and light. And, it was just all hands on deck, as much packaging as you can. And Rae talked about it. Some of the other alternatives to what folks traditionally use can be expensive. One other thing is on the fiber category I've been learning lately in some of my work is renewable, those streams, those feedstocks to make those products can be limited. So if someone's going to spend millions of dollars retrofitting for a whole new type of feedstock, but that feedstock may only be available from that supplier for 2 years, that's it. The other challenge they're dealing with is they're thinking long-term about what's the next best thing to get PFAS to replace the molded fiber or a new type of fiber. And those are some of the challenges I'm hearing as well. One last thing I'll talk about, we had this sort of serendipitous situation where we have a large QSR, Chick-fil-A, who was kind of frustrated with that paper deli, wrap category. And so we kept getting, samples in. And anyway, the long story short is we've decided to superload 3 major tests with various papers, PFAS-free categories, to expedite finding what works well under ASTM, what makes the total fluorine, and also what disintegrates. So for the first time in history, I think, we've got ASTM experts, paper making experts, composters, and chemists that design products talking about the results, and that's never really happened before. So we're pretty excited about that space developing, right here in little old Washington-based Compost Manufacturing Alliance. But we hope that we'll learn even more about some of the alternatives that we'll be able to share. So to close, there's some great resources here for you. We've got our testing protocol available on our site. Center for Environmental Health encourage you to reach out and look at their site. Responsible Buying Purchasers Network also has some great materials on how to buy materials and alternatives. And the U.S. Composting Council continues to develop their resources on PFAS because obviously it's a topic of concern. We're grateful folks like you are all getting together to talk about dealing with the issue, but they're also, working around the country on this issue. So thank you for the opportunity to present this to you, and I look forward to the Q&A at the end of the sessions.
Fantastic. Thank you, Susan. I think we have a few, I guess, a couple minutes for some clarifying questions, if there were any for Susan that we wanted to talk about right now. All right, hearing none, we will move on to our next presenter, Dr. Kelvin Okamoto from Green Bottom Line.
Good morning, everyone. Let me pull up my presentation. Unfortunately, my presentation doesn't have a lot of pictures, so it's not nearly as nice or fancy as Heather and Ray and Susan. Sometimes the science just isn't pretty and there's not a lot of pictures you can do. But my name is Kelvin Okamoto, he, him, with Green Bottom Line. I do work with CMA as a technical advisor also. And I thank King County and Tristan and Rory for inviting me to speak on the PFAS science and testing. The other thing I'll mention is I am also chair of ASTM 2096 that sets the standards for biodegradation, biodegradability testing and specifications, like for composting and also for bio-based content. And just one thing I'll note is that approved acceptable alternatives are great. However, one of the other things that's required is they must pass compostability testing. And I'll just make a comment that clay coating from paper does not pass, and neither does many of the waxes. There's only a few wax types that are actually considered compostable. And we do have to be aware of that, because to meet like CMA's requirements, they must pass compostability testing too. I should also know polyvinyl alcohol is water biodegradable, but is still undergoing testing for compostability today. So going into the presentation. So PFAS was mentioned, it's perfluoroalkyl substances. Originally, it was largely for a certain class of chemicals that included PFOA and PFOS, which is Teflon, which is produced in Teflon.
Kelvin,
and other.
Your slide didn't advance. You're not in presentation mode.
Oh, I'm on my presentation mode, sorry.
I know you may need to go out and back in again, because I was in another webinar earlier today, they had the same problem.
Okay, thank you. Can you see PFAS? What is the concern?
Yep, now you're good.
Okay, thank you. Sorry about that. How come it's not advancing? Sorry, trying to go backwards now. There we go. So it covered PFOA and PFOS and a number of other chemicals that were largely associated with Teflon. And it's a class that includes hundreds, if not thousands, of chemicals. It also now includes polyfloralalkyl substances, which is any chemical with more than one fluorine on the alkyl carbon chain. Did that advance? What is the concern?
Yes.
As a class, there's acute toxicity and chronic toxicity, biological persistence, and environmental persistence. So it has a number of things going against it. The issue is that the class is now so large that different chemicals within the class of PFAS have different issues. And just as one down there, C8 PFOA, which is the Teflon associated or the Scotchgard associated chemical, has a half-life in humans of about 70 days. And the PFBA C4 has a half-life in humans of about 36 hours. So the biological persistence or the chronic toxicity associated with a C4 would be much less than for a C8. Right now, there's a lot of discussions over how to treat the dramatic differences between the different chemicals within what is considered this class. So as mentioned before, PFAS used in food packaging is primarily a water and grease resistant to paper and fiber-based products. And as Heather Trim showed this same slide, how much is in the compost? Great study by Heather Trim, Linda Lee, and her students. Reason why I'm showing this is that, yes, it's demonstrating that there is a lot of PFAS in compost that brings in residual and commercial food waste and compostable products. The part that we're missing is the direct link between what is coming in and what you're getting out. And one of the possible issues is that a lot of these chemicals here, granted this is in 2017, are not the chemicals presently used in many of your incoming pulp molded and fiber-based products if they have PFAS in it. They may be breakdown products, but that we don't know yet. So how do we test for that? And that's the question. And right now the science is still catching up. You could do extraction or migration testing of PFAS from pulp molded or paper products. This is very standard. In fact, you'll see, especially labs in Europe, that will do extraction testing of paper products and say there's no PFAS or there's no fluorine product coming out. Unfortunately, those methods do not give you the proper results because PFAS binds to the fibers in paper and pulp molded products. It will not extract out or migrate as to the complete extent that one might expect from such testing. So we must actually develop a test that degrades the fibers first and releases the PFAS without destroying it. Development work on this test method is underway. Fiber breakdown may have been developed and further evaluation is needed by more than one lab. But then what is needed is the isolation, identification, and quantification methods for specific PFAS chemicals needs to be started. And in fact, Professor Linda Lee at Purdue, who is actually near where I live, is actually agreed to do some of this work for the company that has developed the fiber breakdown method. This will take several years to develop. The eventual goal is an ASTM standard test method that we can all go back and refer to and everybody use so we can get similar results. It's 2 to 3 year total timeline anticipated for the approval. Not having that kind of test available, what do we do now? And right now, San Francisco, BPI, CMA, Europe, and so on, use what's called a total fluorine testing determination. And they set the limit at 100 parts per million of fluorine. The other part is they'll often say that you cannot have intentionally added PFAS. And the total fluorine testing is a way to determine if you have that or not. Typically, when you have fluorine with intentionally added PFAS, it's 1,200 parts per million, so well over the 100. The difficulty with total fluorine testing is that it picks up fluorine from all sources. From minerals, fluorite, which is a very common mineral, is in talc, calcium carbonate, and a lot of others that are mined. It is in mold release agents for plastics and for paper, and it's a processing aid. And most of those are not PFAS. They are, in the case of, for instance, for plastics like sort of PLA, the mold release may actually be silicon fluoride. It's not a carbon-based material. So that would not fit the PFAS related items. Doing something like PIGE or PIGE analysis is a fluorine test only, somewhat qualitative, can be quantitative, but all it tests for is fluorine. It doesn't tell you what the actual fluorine containing chemical is. So to determine PFAS content with total fluorine testing, you must go back and analyze for other fluorine sources that may actually be present too. So total fluorine testing is digestion followed by typical fluorine analysis, which is often ISE. It's ion-specific electrodes used in chromatography or some other type of analysis. PFAS containing fiber-based samples tested for total fluorine content with and between labs has resulted in results from 37 to 1,300 parts per million. That's not an acceptable range. And so Ron Walling and Advanced Materials Center ran round robin between labs to determine the cause. He used, misspelled that, Galbraith, QC Metallurgy, and Chembec, which are 3 labs that have been doing a lot of fluorine tests, total fluorine testing over the years. And what was determined is that you need to have a large enough specimen sample and you must digest the whole sample. So digest the sample of at least 1 gram. The full product specimen has been ground and sampled, and you run the test in duplicate. And if the 2 results are dramatically different, you have to run at least a 3rd test. Additionally, most importantly, digestion must be performed in a closed environment, which is typically an oxygen bomb or PAR bomb. It's actually a small vessel that is completely enclosed, and you heat it up and it forces the digestion of the material inside. The reason why it has to be closed is that the fluorine components upon digestion are volatile. And so a lot of places we're using an open air crucible and losing the fluorine content. The same product at all those 3 labs following these procedures now test at 1,200 parts per million total fluorine in all 3 labs. CMA has adopted the protocol developed from all this. Additional labs can be added. Soil control lab in California is probably going to be very soon. ASTM drafting standard, we are drafting a standard in ASTM now for total fluorine testing digestion following these procedures, with the first ballot scheduled for fall 2021. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kelvin, for wrapping up our presentations this morning. And now we have about 5 minutes before we go into the Zoom breakout rooms to have a general Q&A session. So I just wanted to give some opportunity for attendees to ask some general questions to the whole group and all the presenters before we move into those more tailored Q&A breakout rooms.
I have a question that's slightly related, but maybe not. And it's more for Kelvin and Susan and maybe Heather. And it's about organic compost and how it's defined as organic, knowing that it likely has PFAS in it.
Good question. And organic is to some extent depends on the composter and how they want to define it. But if they want to follow the USDA's National Organic Substance Board's National Organics Protocol, then there are listings of exactly what's accepted. There are no plastics accepted, not even PLA. But they do accept paper-based products that do have PFAS in it. So that's where there's a disconnect between what some might consider being truly organic and not organic in the definition. So one has to look at what the National Organic Substance Board and the National Organics Protocol have actually accepted. And there's a committee that's put together of mostly policymakers and farmers that actually make that decision. There's not, you can submit information, but they determine what's acceptable and not acceptable based upon what their own feelings are.
Great. Thank you, Shirley and Kelvin. So next we wanted to go to Josh Marks, who has his hand raised.
Yeah, hi, thank you. My question is, this issue really reminds me of, as Susan alluded to, the herbicide challenge that we had probably 20 years ago, where there were a number of chemicals that were showing up in compost that were actually killing plants, and we saw evidence. It was very clear that this was a problem. And I'm just curious, what data or does the science here? Do we know the compost that has unacceptable levels of PFAS or any levels of PFAS, is that showing up in